I'm very happy to have our master today with us to discuss the idea of the phrasing of the makam. And this idea is so great and so useful for appreciating, understanding, for creating an improvisation, takseems, as well as composing a music. Without further ado, hi, master.
Hello, it's very nice to see you again. How are you?
Good. This is
Very
yet
good.
another great interview, viewers, for sure, because I think this subject is maybe a subject of Rose that he gives great seminars on, and I have seen myself a great value added actually to me and to many others.
Well, I'm very, very pleased to hear that.
Yeah, so Rose, what's the idea of the phrasing of the makams?
Well, it's a particularly old idea. Actually,
Mm,
it's certainly not anything new, and it's certainly not something which is mine. It may be an observation of mine, but not. But it's something which has been around for a very, very long time. There's been an unfortunate misunderstanding, I would say, primarily in the Western world, that modality in music, modal music, is concerned with scales, or somehow that modes are scales. And of course, this is a very incomplete way of seeing modes. Of course, in any mode, I suppose you can derive a scale out of it if you wish, and if you find that to be relevant. But essentially, modes are a collective of phrasing material, and this is what makes them very, very distinct.
mm,
And this is one of the reasons why within the same scale material we can actually have several modes which are quite different and quite distinct and quite easy to recognize as being uh, distinct and individual. So for me, in any of the modal traditions, be it makam, be it dastgah, be it raga, be it the Ichos system of Byzantine music,
mhm,
in any of these modal systems, um, that which is of extreme importance is understanding the phrase material.
mhm,
Uh, Quite often, what has happened is that the people who have written down and who have created, so to speak, the contemporary theory in these traditions have been rather influenced by uh, Western analysis of scale material and of modality.
mhm,
And so they try and present everything through a rather sort of Western viewpoint, which is not really very helpful.
mhm,
And this is something which is easily noticed by students of modal music who are not from the countries from which this music actually derives. Because they read all this material in a book, for example. There are plenty of books, especially in Turkish books,
mm,
uh, describing, the makams and the modes in great detail and things. But when you take all that information, it doesn't actually translate into music.
mhm,
It's not enough.
mm,
And so what you discover immediately is that the way to connect with each of these modes is through the phrase material, and the phrase material is something which you absorb through studying the compositions. And of course, there's a vast repertoire of compositions in each of these modes.
mm,
And when you play these compositions, you will quickly discover that, well, many of these compositions actually do not conform to the description in the theory book, and they do things which are a little bit different.
mhm,
So, what you have to do is you have to look at a large number of compositions. Of course, in each of the traditions, there are certain what we call very representative and sort of hallmark compositions, which this is a composition in which all of the basic features of the makam, they're all present there.
mhm,
Okay, in every tradition, all of the musicians know which these compositions are, so it's very easy to find out. For example, if you're studying the Turkish tradition, you want to know what is the hallmark composition of Segah Makam, go to Yusuf Pasha's Peshrev.
mhm,
Or if you want to know the hallmark composition of Ajay Mashiran, there's Salih Dede's Peshrev. Or um, Beyati, there's Emin Dede, or Seyfettin Osmanolu. There's all these compositions these are the really characteristic compositions of each makam.
mhm,
However, apart from these very characteristic compositions, there are many other compositions
Mhm.
which have certain rather unique and very, very interesting figures, or one particular modulation which you won't find somewhere else.
Mhm.
So it's important to study these as well. And of
Mhm.
course, because there are so many compositions, basically the study of Makam is a lifetime study. It never stops. You're
Mhm.
always learning and absorbing new material, or inventing new material sometimes,
Mhm.
discovering new material.
Yeah.
And it's very much like, I would say, it's very much like studying a language in many ways.
Mhm.
Uh, when you study a language in the very, very early stages, when you're a little baby,
Mhm.
you learn individual letters, and you learn individual words and things like that. But as you go through life, you learn phrasing patterns, you learn ways of expression, you learn different modes of expression,
Yeah.
and you learn more complicated grammatical constructs, and you learn aesthetics of language and all sorts of things like that. So language has many, many dimensions
Jokes,
to it. Yeah. Yes,
jokes,
exactly.
proverbs.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Yes, all these things.
Yeah.
Um, so these are the many, many dimensions
Mm.
of growing into a language.
Mm.
And in modal music, it's exactly the same. As you move into the modes
Mhm.
and you grow into them,
Yeah.
uh, you discover the many, many dimensions to them. But the central feature, I would say,
Mm.
is is connected with the phrasing, with the
Mm.
phrases, how they work.
Mhm.
Everything is connected to that.
Mhm.
Um, well, just like it is in language, basically. It's rather similar. Yeah.
Yeah. We might come to maybe defining what is a phrase, but before we go into that, let me ask
Yes.
you, what was your first encounter of this idea?
Well, my first encounter was, I suppose, because I had studied prior to studying Makam, I'd also studied Indian music,
Mm.
and in Indian music, they're quite clear about that.
Mm.
Okay, there are books which show you scales and things, but they have a thing called pakard, which is a particularly characteristic. It's a bit like the seyir in Makam,
Mhm.
and you can see quite clearly that there for each raga there are certain very characteristic phrases which have to be included, otherwise it just doesn't make sense.
Mm.
So I was aware of this concept through my contact with Indian music,
Mm.
and when I came into contact with Makam music, which my contact with Makam music was primarily through the Turkish tradition,
Mhm.
uh, it became very apparent that something's going on here with the phrasing, because all of the stuff in the theory books is just not translating into music.
Mm.
And I did make the acquaintance of one man in Istanbul many years ago.
Mm.
He was not a well-known person. But he was particularly adept at that. And he didn't actually understand what a scale was.
Mm.
Um, he had an extraordinary memory, and he had memorized practically the entire Ottoman tradition.
Mhm.
Uh, he was a person with a mild case of what you call Asperger's,
Mhm.
which these people quite often have quite exceptional memories and quite exceptional capabilities.
Mm.
And he understood everything as phrases. That's how he understood everything.
Mhm.
And so he presented everything in that way. And on the number of meetings I had with him, I just was completely amazed by his approach to this through phrasing and not through any theoretical constructs or things like that.
Mhm.
And I realized that yes, this is the essence of it. And if you don't approach it in that way, you're not really going to get anywhere with it.
Mhm.
And so the contact with him basically sort of was a type of shock treatment for me, which pushed me in a totally different direction
Mhm.
and enabled me to see things quite differently,
Mhm.
and to realize that yes, okay, all of the information in the theory books, it's all very nice, and if
Mm.
it's helpful, fine, no problem, but that is not the essence of it. The essence of it
Mm.
is contained in the compositions and in the phrase material in the compositions.
Uh-huh. Okay, interesting. So, to you now, after this encounter and from the previous and all of these kinds of experiences, how can we say what is a phrase in musical terms? Yeah.
Yes, a phrase is in music
Mm,
is very much like a sentence in speaking.
mm,
It's a complete. It's something which is complete, and it has a beginning, an end, and a middle,
mm-hmm,
um, and it conveys something. It's recognizable.
mm,
It's very distinct. Usually, a phrase in music will have a certain feeling to it. It'll be, I mean, in very broad terms, sad or happy,
mm-hmm,
um, the major and minors, things like that.
mm-hmm,
Um, and
mm-hmm,
yes, it's a complete entity in itself. It's sort
mm-hmm.
of self-contained, and usually phrases can also be very, very flexible. You can pull them this way, pull them that way. They
Mm.
remain identifiable.
Yeah.
Um, these last 2 years, I've had the good fortune
Mm,
to study also the Iranian musical tradition,
mm,
and which, of course, I'd heard quite a lot of Iranian music up until now in my life, but I'd never had the opportunity to properly study it. And this year, I had that opportunity.
mm-hmm,
And in the Iranian tradition, the so-called radif, which they refer to as the repertoire,
mm-hmm.
they're very, very clear about this, about the whole aspect of the
Mm.
importance of phrasing. They
Yeah.
probably put more emphasis on this than anybody else.
Mm,
And they have this concept of the dastgah and the avaz, which are the main modes and the subsidiary modes. Then they have lots and lots of these little entities, little areas, be they rhythmic or melodic, which are
mm,
called gushe.
mm-hmm.
Gusheha is the plural.
Yeah.
And it, in observing how these interact with the main modes, you can see very, very clearly the importance of phrasing.
Mm,
And you can see quite clearly the definition of a phrase
mm,
through observing these little phrase entities.
mm,
So I suppose the best way to describe this to somebody,
mm,
as I would imagine that some of our listeners may not be musicians, to somebody who is not a musician,
mm,
is to compare a phrase in music to a sentence in language.
mm,
That it's something which is a complete entity which conveys a certain meaning, a certain feeling.
mm,
Uh, it's easy, it's recognizable. It has a certain completeness to it. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Yeah,
mm. Interesting.
yeah.
So, uh, is there an effort, or maybe we need some effort to categorize these kinds of phrases, like in a way that we can use them as a tool set to understand or maybe build stuff with it?
Well, yes. In the Turkish and Arabic system, you have what you refer to in Arabic as jins or ajna, which is the plural.
Yes. Yes.
Um, this is important. These are small entities,
Mm,
small regions.
mm-hmm,
Uh, People also refer to them as tetrachords or pentachords. I think referring to them as tetrachords or pentachords is perhaps a little bit deceptive because
mm-hmm.
it just again goes back to the whole idea of scales and not to the idea of phrasing.
Yeah.
But if we were to take, for example, the makam Hijaz, for example, which is a very common makam in either the Turkish or the Arabic tradition,
Mm,
and it's very similar in both traditions. Basically, Hijaz is just, it all takes place within a very, very small area of the scale.
mm,
A small area in a small tonal area.
mm,
If we're doing it from, let's say, from re, the note re,
mm-hmm,
uh, it extends down one tone to do, and it goes up to the sol, maybe up to the la. It's just in that little area there, and it's a certain type of phrasing which happens in that area.
mm-hmm,
Uh, Once you move out of that area, so if you go up to the fourth degree and then you start to use other phrasing above that,
mm-hmm.
you're actually moving into another area
Yeah.
and into another jins, into another, or cheshni as they call it in Turkey.
Mm,
The Turkish word cheshni means literally flavor.
mm-hmm,
Um, and so, yes, that's sort of how they get used. And so this way of categorizing them as either jins or cheshni, as the Turks do,
mm-hmm,
I think it's not bad at all, actually.
mm,
And the basic ajnas or the basic cheshniler are not that many. It's
Mm.
a small number which get put in different positions.
Mhm.
This, however, is a little bit deceptive because if you were to transpose that Hijaz movement
Mm.
to another region and combine it with other ajnas or other Chechny,
Mhm.
uh, it's not just a matter of transposition. It actually acquires new characteristics and new phrasing
Mm.
possibilities.
Mhm.
So it's not just a question that we transpose it, we take it up a fifth or down a fourth or things like that. Okay, that does happen, but also other things come into it.
Mhm.
That's where I find the Iranian concept of the couche, which
Mhm.
in Farsi, as I understood, means quite literally corners.
Yeah.
I like that idea.
Yes.
Um, that's where I find that interesting because they may do what looks like the same movement in a different register,
Mm.
but they approach it very, very differently because it's in combination with other elements.
Yeah.
So, yes, it is a good thing to see the basic
Mm.
ajnas or the basic um, cheshni,
Mm.
but it's also important to see that when they change position, they actually change character and they change behavior patterns as well. So
Mm.
it needs something a bit more complicated, a bit more comprehensive, should we say, than
Mm.
just ajna and cheshni there.
Yeah.
Uh, I think it's time actually for the whole modal system to be revised.
Mm.
Uh, and when I say revised, I don't mean modernized. No, I mean perhaps the opposite. um,
Yeah.
because the modernization of it has just brought about the westernization of it, which I think
Mm.
was a mistake.
Yeah.
And I think it's time that we go back to look at what it was before,
Mm.
um, because they seem to have a broader concept of it in older times than what we do today.
Mhm.
Um, Today, unfortunately, in many of the modal traditions, we see a lot of rather sort of uncomfortable examples of Western influence,
Mm.
which, of course, I'm anything but anti-Western. I'm Western myself, but I mean, but no, but what
Mm.
I see is that there are certain things which do not work well together.
Mm.
Or if they are to work well together, it requires much more thought and uh, much greater care, so to speak.
Mhm.
The fact that we now see, for example, especially in Arabic and, well, actually more in Turkish, actually, less so in
Mm.
Arabic, but we see in both traditions, for example, kanun players filling everything full of arpeggios and things like that, major and minor arpeggios.
Mm.
Um, this is an unfortunate distortion which
Uh-huh.
does not actually improve the tradition. It's not something which is enriching it. It's
Mhm.
limiting it because
Yeah.
it's what has happened is that people have now become a bit confined to a certain category of makam in which this sort of thing more or less works.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Mm.
Kurdi makam or nihavent or things like
Mm.
that, which they look more like major and minor scales or mahur or things like that,
Mm. Mm.
and it doesn't actually help the music. And sometimes other modes which perhaps have rather more unusual, so we say, intervals,
Mhm.
tend to be ignored
Mm.
because they cannot be treated in this sort of modern semi-European manner.
Mm.
Uh, and I'm of the school that I think that the Eastern modal traditions have great value in themselves.
Mm.
They have enormous possibilities to go forward in a creative manner
Mhm.
without having to abandon their basic characteristics and take on the characteristics of some other tradition.
Mhm.
In tradition, I think it's most important to always go forward, to always progress, and to always discover new things,
Mhm.
but to work primarily with your own material. I think that that's
Mm.
important.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh, Rose, I think I always think about it this way. I believe that this is like a game that it has its own rules, its own
yes,
principles, and if you like to play the game, you play it with its own rules, and then you can maybe extend or maybe rename the game to something else rather than destroying or altering
Yes,
or maybe attacking that game for some
yes,
reason, right? Uh,
that's true. Yes,
yeah.
um, you know, if we go back in time,
Hmm.
let's go back 100 years, for example,
Hmm.
and let's say, okay, I live on the island of Crete here. Crete is an island in the middle of the Mediterranean.
Hmm.
It's always had lots of contact with with other areas of the Mediterranean, especially the Eastern Mediterranean.
Hmm.
It has ports, so boats come and go and things. We didn't have airplanes 100 years ago, but no,
Hmm.
boats, yes.
Yeah.
So let's say that I'm a musician here on Crete, and I've learned how to play the local tradition of playing how to play the lira and things like that.
Mm.
And somebody comes on a boat from somewhere else, and I get to hear them play one evening or something like that. Of course, musicians 100 years ago were not thinking about preserving tradition. No, they were musicians that whatever they listened to was interesting, and
Mm.
they would listen to it and take from it.
Mm.
But the the amount of material they were absorbing from their native environment
Mm.
and the amount of material that was coming to them from foreign sources was in a certain proportional relationship,
Hmm.
which was balanced.
Yeah.
And that the majority of what they were actually hearing and what they were experiencing as musicians was coming from their native environment.
Mm.
And a smaller percentage of material was coming from outside and at a speed which was fairly easy to absorb. They weren't hearing, 100 different types of music all in one day or things like that, which is what we're doing now.
Yeah.
Maybe they'd, once every month, somebody from a foreign land would turn up with an instrument and play something. So they were able to take influences from whatever they heard, absorb them in a manner which was, at a speed which was human,
Hmm.
and to absorb this material in a way which was sort of, should we say, organic.
Mm.
Today, people are literally bombarded with all sorts of sounds and
Mm.
images from all over the world and from many different sort of unrelated contexts in many ways.
Hmm.
And people have a very hard time fitting all of this into a cohesive whole.
Mm.
And it's understandable, of course. So, if you're a musician today living on Crete and you're playing the lira and you've heard the local tradition, but you turn on the radio and you hear pop music from New York, or you hear
Mm.
music for an advertisement from France, or you hear this and this, hear all this stuff all together, it's very difficult for the musician today to
Hmm.
be able to absorb all of this in
Yeah.
a deeper way and to digest it and to be able to use it creatively and cohesively. This is the
Hmm.
difficulty.
Yeah.
And so, in many of these cases, the aesthetic has been seriously upset.
Hmm.
And you see all sorts of things which are sort of stuck together in this coexistence, which they don't really fit together. And
Mm.
they actually clash with each other, these different elements.
Mm.
And this has unfortunately distorted
Mm.
many of these musical traditions. Another thing, of course, is that I think I've mentioned this before, perhaps in one of our other talks, that
Mm.
I remember clearly in the 1980s when I was a student
Mm.
of Kostas Mundakis here on Crete, studying Cretan lira, and I
Hmm.
was also going frequently to Istanbul to study the Turkish kemençe with Ihsan Özgen.
Uh-huh.
And I remember, here on Crete, the instrument of Crete is the lira, okay?
Hmm.
And I would go to Istanbul, and nobody in Istanbul knew that they played lira on Crete.
Mm.
But here on Crete, nobody knew that they played lira in Istanbul either.
Yeah.
And in both environments, nobody knew that they played lira in Bulgaria or in the south of Italy or in a number of other different places.
Hmm.
But everybody knew Michael Jackson's latest hits. So
Yeah.
this is a bit sad in many ways, is that
Mm.
there's this thing where everybody has their eyes on what's going on
Mm.
in the big urban centers of the Western world and the big commercial centers of the Western world, basically.
Hmm.
Uh, and of course, you have the people in the big multinational recording companies of that time
Mm.
who were thinking, well, why should I make a separate recording for Crete, a separate recording for the south of Turkey, a separate recording for Egypt, and a separate. Let's
Mm.
make one recording in New York and we'll sell it to everybody.
Mm.
And, okay, this made commercial sense, of course.
Mm.
but it doesn't make cultural sense.
mm,
So we're still stuck now with this attitude whereby people in these various countries which do have still existing strong indigenous cultures
mm,
are unfortunately being encouraged to digress from these indigenous cultures
mm,
and to start looking at things like pop music or jazz or rock music or whatever else, each of which is fine in its own
mm,
context. But when taken out of context, it can actually become ridiculous.
mm,
And especially some of these rather naive combinations I hear every once in a while, in which there is an attempt to integrate, should we say, traditional music such as is makam music or daska or raga music,
mm,
with jazz, for example,
mm,
uh, which is a very, very valid and very, sort of beautiful tradition, of course. But sometimes there's just this very simple equation which says that, okay, well, we have improvisation in Arabic music, we have improvisation in jazz, so they go together perfectly well.
yeah.
Excuse me.
Mm,
Without, however, understanding that what is meant by improvisation in Arabic music or Turkish music is entirely different from what is meant by improvisation in jazz.
mhm,
It's not at all the same thing.
mm,
Um, of course, some musicians have taken the trouble to look at this more deeply
mm,
and have come up with some interesting ideas. But for the most part, many of these attempts at what is called fusion end up simply as confusion. And uh, it's a bit sad, really, because
mm,
there's pressure on the musicians to do this.
mm.
I don't think it's necessarily a natural development.
Yeah, interesting.
Mm.
So, discussing the idea of categorization and
Yes.
putting this into an range knowledge accessible for those who would like to either understand, appreciate, or maybe do something with this kind of music. Can we put these phrases into groups or families?
Yes, I think it's possible, yes.
Mm,
Um, families, actually, in Turkish, the word aile, which means family, is
mm,
actually used. Uh,
mm.
there's Hijaz ailesi, Ushak ailesi, and things that was, the
That's
Hijaz family,
Arabic
the
word.
Ushak family. It's an
Aila.
Arabic. It's Arabic. Yes. Is it? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
well, of course, in Turkish there are plenty of well, there used to be even more, but there are still plenty of Arabic words there.
Yeah,
Uh,
interesting. Yeah.
yes, and so this word is used in their terminology. I'm not sure. Do you use this in the Arabic
Yeah,
terminology?
we
You
do,
do.
but maybe later, Master, I will maybe discuss a few of the problems
Aha.
that
Right.
occur in the three main Makam
Right.
musics.
Aha. Okay.
I'll maybe ask you a few questions about that. Yeah.
Of course. Of
Mm,
course. I'll be happy to
mm,
discuss that.
mm,
Um, again, I think that what we really need is to have a. It would be very nice to organize a big conference at some point
mm,
in which people will be invited from the Arabic Makam tradition, from the Turkish Makam tradition, from the Iranian Dastgah tradition, from the Indian Raga system, or from the Byzantine Ichos system.
mhm,
These are some of the major modal traditions which we find in existence today. They're perhaps the largest ones, that particular family.
mhm,
It would be very interesting to get people together from each of these traditions and see how they approach what are in many ways the same subject.
mm,
Uh, the process of categorization. I think that the Arabs and the Turks could learn a lot from the Persian system of categorization.
yeah.
Um, I think also that some elements of the Arabic tradition could be extremely useful and helpful for people of the Iranian or from the Turkish tradition to understand, and vice versa.
Mhm,
Certain aspects of what is done in Byzantine music, the way they categorize things,
mm,
is also particularly interesting.
mm,
Uh, even something as very, very basic as the whole concept of soft and hard intervals,
mm,
which we don't actually find that in the other traditions. It
mm,
happens, of course,
mm,
but they don't define it quite as clearly. The Byzantine way tradition defines this extremely clearly, and
mm,
it would be very helpful for other people to see that.
mm,
Just as they would benefit greatly
mm,
from seeing certain aspects of the Turkish, Arabic, and Persian and Indian
mm,
approach.
mm,
I think the Byzantine, Arabic, Turkish, and Iranian are very close, and this
mm.
would also include Azeri and also other
Uzbeks. Mm,
Uzbeks, yes, Central Asian traditions as well, the whole Makam world, basically.
mm. Yeah.
I think they have a lot. The Indian raga system at a bit of a distance, actually. It's
Mm,
amazing, of course, and it is influenced actually by the Persian tradition, especially the North Indian.
yeah.
Um, but it is a bit of a separate subject in many ways. It has a bit of a distance from the others.
Mm,
Uh, but especially everything in the Makam world, which I would say, uh, you know, very, very close to that is the Iranian Dastgah or the Byzantine Ichos system. They're all very, very similar.
mm,
I think all of these traditions really need to get together,
mm,
put all of their material on the table, and see what
mm,
can be of benefit of the one to the other, and to sort of pool all of this knowledge and share it, and come up
mm.
with something new which will be beneficial to all of them,
Yeah.
without each one of them losing their individuality and their identity. Of course, this is also important.
Yeah.
It must not just become a big, sort of homogeneous soup which tastes of nothing.
Yeah.
But I
Interesting.
think that there are certain things which are done in the one tradition which would be very, very helpful to the people in the other. And
Mm,
it'd be very nice to see them share all of that and to come up with
mm.
something which is beneficial to all.
Yeah. So, Master, if we go for this kind of categorizing them in two families, can
Yes,
we say we have Hijaz
yes,
flavors together in one
yes,
box? We have the Bayati and whatever family
yes.
in one place, the rest and so on. Can we please elaborate on from your experience? I mean,
Well,
such, yeah.
I mean, the Hijaz family has one very, very basic characteristic,
Mm,
which is that large augmented interval there,
mm,
the three semitone interval.
mm. Yeah.
Um, this is very characteristic of the whole Hijaz family, of course.
Mm,
Um, this needs a certain qualification, which
mm,
is what I referred to previously, coming from the Byzantine terminology, which
mm,
is the quality of soft and hard intervals.
mm,
So, for example, the intervals of Hijaz itself in the Hijaz Makam, that whole sort of Hijaz jins as we find it in the Makam Hijaz itself,
mm,
uh, uses what we call soft intervals.
mm,
When we refer to a soft interval with reference to Hijaz, we mean that three semitone interval is
mm.
smaller, it shrinks.
Yes.
So the semitone on the bottom is further away from the tonic,
Mm,
and the semitone uh, which is below the fourth degree
mm.
is further away from the fourth degree, so that it becomes the three semitone interval becomes smaller.
Yes.
This is um, these type of intervals in Byzantine music are known as chromatic.
Mm,
Um, this, of course, is totally different from the use of the word chromatic in Western music, which means semitone intervals. But no, in Byzantine music, chromatic means using this particular three semitone interval.
mm.
So what we have are soft and hard chromatic intervals, depending on which tetrachord we're using and where we find it.
Yeah.
So, example, in the case of the basic jins of Hijaz within the Hijaz Makam itself,
Mm,
this is using soft intervals.
mm.
Hijaz is also found in the upper section of Nihavend, for example, Nahawand, as you call it.
Yeah.
Um, However, the intervals there are the three semitone interval is larger in
Mm,
that particular context.
mm,
So, let's say we're taking Nahawand from Re.
mm,
So the B flat
mm,
is closer to what we would call a tempered B flat. It's not quite as sharp
mm,
as would be in the case of
mm,
the same flavor in Hijaz,
mm,
and also the C sharp is also closer to the Re than
mm,
would be the soft interval.
mm.
So that whole three semitone interval becomes larger, and this is what we call a hard chromatic movement.
Mhm.
These are hard chromatic intervals.
Yeah.
We have the same thing which happens also with the whole Bayati or Ushak, however you wish to call it,
Mm.
which again there are intervals in which the these are called diatonic intervals in the
Mm.
case of Bayati or Ushak
Mm.
in the Byzantine system. Or they're referred to in Turkish as Ushak. I see the Ushak family, or I don't know, I
Mm.
suppose in Arabic they refer to it more as Bayati.
Yes.
Um, yes. Well, what happens there is that, let's say we're again taking this from the note re.
Mm.
You're using re, your mi is very low,
Mm.
quite low, but it's not a mi flat, it's not a mi natural, it's in between there.
Mm.
Now, depending on which mode it is, that mi is either a bit higher or a bit lower.
Mm.
This note is known as sega.
Yeah.
Um, in my view, sega should not be seen as a note, but as an area
Mm.
uh, in which, depending on the direction you're moving, depending on the makam you're playing, you can be either a bit higher or a bit lower within that area.
Mm.
So if you're playing the makam sega itself, then the note, the sega note, will be at a higher point within that area,
Mm.
closer to the do,
Yeah.
but still lower than a tempered C natural.
Mm-hmm.
If you're playing ushak, that particular note will be at the low end. It will not be a B flat, no, but it will not. It'll be not as high as the same note played in Makam Sega. It'll be a bit lower.
Mm.
And if you're playing Husseini or Bayati, it could be at different positions. It depends on the. Also, if you're going up, it's a bit higher. If you're coming down, it's a bit lower.
Mm.
It's a very sort of volatile note and very flexible.
Gravity wise. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yes, yeah. It's
Yeah.
affected by the gravity. This is
Mm. Mm.
a term which I think is very relevant to this music.
Mm.
We have what we call tonal gravity, which means that we have certain very powerful notes within each mode
Mm.
which attract other notes in
Yeah.
their direction.
Mm.
Um, we use this word actually in Greek. We use the word elxi, which means attraction,
Mm.
for this particular phenomenon in music,
Mm.
uh, whereby one note is very powerful in its influence on other ones and draws it towards it, closer
Mm.
to it.
Mm.
So certain notes within a given mode have a greater flexibility. Certain notes are very fixed. For
Mm.
example, the tonic or the fourth or the fifth tend to be quite fixed.
Mm.
Whereas other notes, especially if we're looking at the Bayati or Ushak family, certainly the second and the sixth degree are particularly flexible
Mm.
and they're very much influenced by the tonal gravity of what's going on around them.
Mm.
Uh, so yes, um, we can look at those two basic families. We
Mm.
can look at what are called soft and hard intervals within both of those families.
Mm.
Um, and then we can look at how these intervals are affected by tonal gravity,
Mm.
and how we get different constructs out of that, different
Mm.
flavors, different cheshni or jins,
Mhm.
due to the influences of either soft and hard intervals
Mhm.
in terms of developing a system
Mm.
of categorization
Yeah.
which is not purely theoretical but does actually have full practical implications.
Mm. Okay, so the categorization is maybe preferred to go with the Byzantine system of soft, hard, and chromatic.
Well, I think that's one thing which the
Mm.
Byzantine system could contribute.
Mm.
Is that whole the definition of soft and hard and things and how it actually works.
Yeah.
Beyond that, however, I think that other things could be contributed by other systems.
Mm.
And what we really need is something whereby each of these systems contributes something. I mean, certainly from the Iranian
mm,
uh, tradition,
mm,
they go beyond just the concept uh, of the Cheshni or the Ajna or whatever things like that. They
mm, mm,
have this whole thing of the Gusheha, which are very, very specific and
mm.
uh, very detailed. Some of them are melodic, some of them are rhythmic as well.
Yeah. Yes.
Um,
Mm,
there are certain gusheha which are actually rhythmic patterns and not melodic patterns
mm,
necessarily,
mm.
and how they combine and how they interact and make, sort of different, very recognizable features.
Yeah.
So I think that in a new categorization or in a new, should we say, the development of a new, what you might
Mm,
call theory of this music,
mm,
which is closer to practice,
mm.
I think that from all of these different traditions, there are elements to be taken which could be
Mm.
extremely helpful.
Yeah.
Uh,
Now that you highlighted the dangerous use of scales, there are also
yes,
other few things there, like the idea of chords, the idea of trichords, tetrachords, pentachords, and so on. What do we do with these? These are
yes.
so common nowadays in the use.
Well, yes, when you start to look at things like a scale,
Mm,
it's sort of the next step basically is for
mm,
somebody to come along and start sort of thinking, okay, let's make these into chords and things like that. And uh, okay, there's nothing wrong with chords, of course, but
mm,
uh, when you're working with a type of music such as are these modal traditions,
mm,
in which the intervals are not tempered.
mm,
I mean, in many cases, even intervals such as the fourth degree are not tempered.
mm,
It's not just a matter of the third degree or the second degree.
mm,
Um, well, then the use of chords becomes a bit problematic
mm,
on a purely technical level.
mm,
Okay, how do you do a major chord for what is truly rast, in which the third degree of rast is very, very low. So
mm,
if you make a major chord with that particular interval, it doesn't sound very nice, actually.
mm,
So what people tend to do is they tend to just sort of alter the interval so that it sounds good as a chord.
mm,
But that becomes a distortion of the music.
mm,
And even in cases where uh, there's not necessarily a distortion, let's
mm,
say we take the case of Nahawand, where uh, it looks rather like a Western minor scale. It's not very far away from that.
mm,
Yes, but when you play the melody without imposing harmony on it, the internal relationship of the notes with each other is quite specific.
mm,
If, however, we were playing Nahawan from the note Do, for example, um, if you're doing that and the Mi flat, you make a chord of the Do, Mi flat, and the Sol,
mm,
well, you're imposing a certain um, relationship between the notes, which
mhm,
may not be in accordance with the relationship which is dictated by the melody itself.
mhm,
The result usually ends up that when you put a minor chord on Nahawand, it just
mm.
becomes very sugary and a bit sort of bit cheesy, as we call
Yeah,
it.
I was waiting
Um,
for this expression.
yes, this is an American expression, which is actually rather
Yeah,
good for situations like that. Um, there
yeah.
was an Indian author called Nikhil Jairasboy,
Mm,
who actually, in one of his books on Indian ragas, did an analysis
mm,
of how the hierarchy of notes within a given raga is affected if you're playing the raga with a single note drone, a two note drone, or
mm,
if you suddenly increase that to a three note drone of a major or minor chord.
mm,
And what he shows is that the tonal relationship gets very seriously altered by the
mm,
number of other notes which are being sounded at the same time.
mhm,
So it's not just in our imaginations that happens. It is something which is quite sort of physically demonstrable,
mm,
uh, and it's something which certainly people should pay attention to and be careful of, because you
mm,
can seriously alter the aesthetic of a piece of music
mm,
by imposing on it different things, like like taking a modal melody and just harmonizing it according to the dictates of Western harmony.
mm,
It distorts the melody quite seriously.
mm.
Uh, in my view,
Interesting.
that's a bit unfortunate. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. So, Rose, what about certain features that are very useful when we are talking about phrasing? For example, the duration of the note, the ornamentations,
Yes,
certain aspects of the way you show off some idea, like a phrase.
yes. In any of these traditions, what we see
Mm-hmm.
is that you have a specific phrase, a specific melodic motif or a melodic pattern.
Mm,
Okay, it can be expressed either very simply as a very basic skeleton,
mm,
or you can hear it in its fully embellished
mm.
uh, form.
Yeah.
In each of these traditions, be they folk or classical, it doesn't really matter.
Mm,
Um, what is extremely important is the manner in which melodies are embellished, or the way they're treated, and the way that they're sort of, should we say, decorated.
mm-hmm.
Um, it's like having, like having a room which is just four walls, white, and a ceiling and a floor.
Mm,
Okay, we put furniture in it, we put decoration on the wall, we turn it into a living space.
mm,
Um, that's very much what happens with many of these modal phrases,
mm,
especially the archetypal modal phrases, where
mm,
it's a very, very simple phrase which has an enormous amount of content, but in
mm,
order for that content to be realized and to be evident and to be clear,
mm,
we ornament it, we present it in a certain way so that it now sort of actually speaks.
mm-hmm.
Uh, so that's why in each of the various different modal traditions, the
Mm,
whole concept of ornamentation is extremely important.
mm,
It's of major importance,
mm,
because that's how we take a room and turn it into a living space,
mm.
as a sort of a metaphor.
Yeah.
Um, and the way it's done in each of the traditions, it's done very differently in the Arabic tradition from the way it's done in the Turkish or the Iranian or the Byzantine or the Azeri or the Indian.
Yeah.
Each tradition has its own way to do this,
Mm,
and this is very much what gives it its identity,
mm,
and makes it very, very clear to you that, okay, I'm now moving into a Turkish room or moving into an Arabic one or into a Persian
mm,
one.
mm.
It's very important because it's an environment, and an environment is very, very important for the living entity which is inside it.
Yeah. Interesting.
Uh,
So, if we take, for example, any of the phrases, let's say an Oshak phrase,
yes,
for sure there are some notes that are more important than others.
yes, yes,
There are, for example, certain ornaments that are allowable or maybe favored in this kind of phrase,
yes,
but maybe the vibration is not favored here, it's favored somewhere else in the same context of the same music. So the duration means the notation, or sorry, the note or the nagma is very important. It takes long time, it repeats many times in the phrase.
yes,
Maybe the relationship between two notes. This is what I learned from you, actually,
yes,
that we always, compare a note to another. We jump between them, and they talk to each other. They relate to each other. These
yes,
are like certain features that are really so important and worth paying attention.
yes. That's true.
Yeah.
This is extremely important,
Mm,
uh, and this is something which quite often,
mm,
uh, Western listeners uh, tend to miss out on this sometimes because it's something which is not so familiar to them.
mhm,
In many modal traditions, the melodic activity may take place within a very small area,
mm,
and there's a lot of detail going on in that little small area,
mm,
which, if, like Western audiences, you're used to music which actually occupies, the melodies may occupy a very large area of the scale.
mm,
They may have arpeggios, they may jump up and down and things like that and move in a quite large area.
mm,
In most modal traditions, melodic activity tends to work within a small area and gradually shift into a higher register or a lower register.
Mm-hmm.
But this is done gradually. It's not done in great leaps and bounds usually.
Mm.
Uh, f- for the most part, there are exceptions, like certain makams, like muhayyer, for example, or makams which tend to work up in the high register. But for the most part, melodic activity tends to work within a fairly small area and gradually shift register and move either up or down.
Mm.
Um, so what you're hearing is within this small area melodic activity, which if your ear is not accustomed to that,
Mm.
you hear everything as being sort of the same. Really, you think, oh, what's going on here? They're playing the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
Um, this is a bit like what happens. I think we've mentioned this before. Uh, when you're on the outside of a particular tradition,
Mm.
you tend to hear everything in there as being, it all sounds the same to me.
Mm.
Whereas to somebody who's on the inside, no, it does not sound the same.
Mm.
I mean, many people who don't know, for example, flamenco music,
Mm.
uh, they just have a passing acquaintance with it. They listen to flamenco singers and they think, because they have a certain timbre, they have a certain approach to singing. The people on the outside think, well, they all sound the same, flamenco singers.
Mm.
Whereas to somebody who is familiar with that tradition, no, they do not sound the same. There's radical differences between them,
Yeah.
enormous differences of quality and style and all these different things. But
Mm.
people on the outside just don't hear that.
Yeah.
And so when you move into the tradition, then you start to see all these details and you start to see this, what you saw from the outside as being a microcosm, suddenly when you're inside, it becomes a macrocosm, and there's a lot of things going on in there which you never saw before.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is true also even of material within a melody. That okay, on the outside, if you're not used to hearing, shall we say, Turkish melodies, and you hear
Mm.
different nuances going on within a movement of Ushak, and it's all
Mm.
taking place within a relatively small area
Mm.
tonally.
Mm.
You may think, if you're not familiar with this, you may hear it and think, well, this all sounds like the same thing over and over again.
Mm.
Whereas, in fact, it's not.
Yeah.
And once you are familiar with it, and once you are at home in this idiom,
Mm.
you hear a lot going on in there, and it's quite varied and quite,
Mm.
it's there's a lot going on there, which
Mm.
people on the outside just don't see that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Interesting. This is like the Indian spices. Many
Yes.
people always associate maybe the phrasing or ideas in music with spices and flavors, as you said
Yes.
earlier, and the combination of things that lead to names of
Yes.
complicated spices for Indian food is an example.
Oh, yes. Yeah, many people in the West they say it's curry, all of it's curry. Sort of. It's not that simple. No,
Yeah,
there's a lot going on there, and there's many, many different recipes and many, many different combinations of the spices which produce
yeah.
specific tastes and produce specific
Mm,
gastronomical experiences. Which
mm.
is not just okay. Indians eat curry. That's
Yeah. So, two more things before we go for a break,
yes,
Master. The people from the inside who criticize their theories or their own understanding of music. So we go for the Persian people. They say, "Oh, we have too many names for too many things. These are just exact things that are repeated in a different degree. These gauchets are the same. I don't know why they call it this name here and that name there. That master and his radif, whatever, they criticize and they say,
yes,
let's go and do whatever the Arabs are doing. They are free in their taqsims.
yeah,
Uh, they are free in jumping makams and so on. We barely understand the idea of a makam and so on. You go for the Arabs, they have their own problems, right?
yes,
They say, "Oh, why do we have too many names for makams? It's just a transposition." Uh, I mean, that guy was doing this and that. Why don't we just modernize
yes,
or
yeah.
harmonize? Or every culture has its own problem. I'm
They have
talking
their own
about the
problems.
majority of
Yeah,
of
yeah,
the problems. Again, for the Turks, where they have their own criticism about the notation, about the movement of commas, the categorization, The old flavor of this that became this that disappeared. After all, this is the modern way
Mm.
of what it should be versus the old-fashioned makams, whatever, old compositions. All of these guys are criticizing their own music, let's say the theory or understanding. While the way we talk now, we see there are great ideas and great practical approaches to music if we take
It's true.
all
Yeah.
of these together in one place. I'm sure you have seen this closely with the community we have.
Yes.
Mm.
Let me just
Hmm.
turn off the Wi-Fi on my phone here, 'cause the connection's a little bit unstable. That's good. Yeah. There is always in any tradition, or in anything actually, there's always room for improvement. That is true.
Hmm.
However, we have to see where the criticism is coming from, um, what it is trying, a criticism which says that, uh, well, everything's too a difference, however, between that which is simple and that which becomes simplistic.
Mm.
Let's take an example of language.
Mm.
Uh, the Greek language has been through many, in antiquity, what we know as ancient Greek. It's been through various different, uh, the Byzantine and the Katharevousa, and then as modern as the spoken Greek language and things
Yeah.
like that.
Mm.
Okay. Uh, it's basically been a process. Some cases that simplification was justified
Hmm.
and beneficial and a positive. For example, uh, what became adopted as the within the 20th century was what's called the motiki, the spoken language,
Mm.
which was the spoken language,
Mm.
whereas the written language was another language called Katharevusa.
Hmm.
Okay, it's very good that the spoken language was afforded a higher status.
Mm.
This is very important. However, there were certain things taken to a bit of an extreme.
Mm.
For example, a lawyer in Greece has a very, very hard time
Mm.
using just the spoken language. He has to resort to the older language.
Mm.
I'm told that something rather similar happens in Turkey as well.
Mm.
That the language which was adopted in Turkey by the modern Turkish state, by Kemal Atatürk himself in the beginning of the 20th century,
Yeah.
which got rid of all of the Arabic and the Persian and all the other influences and kept just the pure Uralo-Altaic base.
Mm.
Well, this sort of reduction, so to speak, of the language,
Mm.
okay, maybe it did have some benefit, but
Mm.
it also had certain negative aspects to it. And
Mm.
there are certain things which it's very difficult to express
Mm.
without resorting to the old Ottoman language.
Mm.
So, yes, in every case, I think we have to be careful when we want to simplify things.
Mm.
If we look at this particular type of music which we're looking at now, which is the makam music of either the Arab world or Greece or Turkey or Central Asia or Iran or anywhere like that,
Mm.
well, these are traditions which, whether we like it or not, they're very large traditions, and there is a lot to be absorbed if you want to say that I am now, I've mastered this tradition, so to speak. If any of us can say that, which I don't think we can actually anyway, but it's relative.
Yeah.
Okay, we live in a world which is dominated primarily by what we call pop music in either its indigenous or its international forms.
Yeah.
In the pop world, everything is about extreme youth, and so basically a pop singer, a pop artist, is basically finished by the age of 25.
Hmm.
So everything gets done very quickly. It's very, it's we learn how to do this quickly. Our career is very short and we're done quickly. Everything's done very quickly. It's very
mm,
Whereas in these different types of traditional music, which we find, these are traditions where there's a lot of material to be absorbed.
mm,
If you want to say that, okay, I've now absorbed all of this material and I have digested it and I'm now in a position to use it creatively.
mhm,
That's why uh, in these traditions, if they do exist,
mm.
masters below the age of 40 are extremely rare, even if they do exist.
Yeah.
Because it takes that long to absorb all of this material, to
Mm,
digest all of this material, and then to be able to utilize it in a creative manner.
yeah.
So these are traditions which are for people who enjoy long journeys.
Mm,
They're not for people who are looking for a short hop, from here to there,
yeah. Yeah.
and quick results. It's not
Mm,
going to happen.
mm,
Okay, the fact that it's a long journey rewards you with the fact that it's a very beautiful journey, and it's
mm,
also something which will give you something very, very rich
mm,
to carry with you,
mm,
and very special, and with enormous possibilities to take you further and further and further. It's a never-ending journey, actually.
mm,
So that's why, yes, we should always be looking for opportunities to improve what we have, to
mm,
make it more accessible, to make it more easily understandable.
mm.
But we should also be very careful to make sure that we're not dumbing it down, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm,
Um, and so we have to be on our lookout for that, to make sure that we're not dumbing it down, but that we are genuinely introducing new concepts or new approaches
mm,
which are helpful, but which do not result in us losing important information or important elements. Yeah,
mm,
it's a delicate balance.
mhm. And I think we already have learned a lot of lessons from history,
Oh yes,
even in music subject itself, and maybe better to avoid our big mistakes that we have done. And
oh yes, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Mm, mhm. So, Rose, can you highlight the seminar levels that you introduce on the phrasing of Makam before we go for a break?
Yes, of course.
Mm,
Um, I basically I came up with for the courses that we do online, for the Labyrinth online courses,
mm,
um, because they can be more frequent than the ones which the live ones. The live ones tend to take place once every year, or maybe twice every year at the most.
mm,
But the online ones could happen a bit more frequently.
mm,
Um, I basically decided to do it this way: that I did the phrasing of account number 1, 2, and 3,
mm,
which focused on the phrasing of what we refer to as the basic makams,
mm,
uh, which are things like the Hijaz, the Bayati, the Ushak, the Husseini,
mm,
Mahur, Ajam, these type of makams, which are quite sort of basic,
mm,
um, and they're sort of the foundation, so to speak. So within that context, it didn't matter
mm,
whether you started with number 1 and went to 2 and went to 3, or if you started in 3, went to 2 and then went to 1.
mm.
Those 3 work at the same level
Yeah.
with the basic material.
Mhm,
From 4, 5, and 6, those courses, they focus on what we call the compound makams, something like Huzam, for example, or something
mm,
like, I don't know, Dilkeshide, or something like Gudeste or something. These makams, which are compound makams, where many different makams
mm.
intersect.
Yeah.
So obviously, in order to go into those, you have to have a working knowledge of the ones on the
Mm,
1, 2, and 3 level, which is the basic material, because all that happens on the 4, 5, and 6 is just a different interaction of the same material, just in different configurations. That's all that's really happening.
mm,
So that's why it made sense to do it that way.
mm,
Um, and that's basically, you know, what you learn in those 6 courses
yeah.
uh, will then, I think, be useful in helping you to understand
Mm,
makams which maybe were not covered in those particular, because obviously in 6 courses we can't cover all of the makams which exist.
yeah. Mm,
Uh, We haven't done Mavereuna here, which is a very, very rare makam anyway. But if
Yeah.
you understand the way that the other compound makams work, then it'll make perfect sense when you encounter that makam. You'll see exactly,
Mm.
it'll be very obvious to you how it works.
Okay.
Um, so it's, of course, in the
Mm.
4, 5, and 6, we don't cover all of the compound makams because
Mm.
there are lots and lots of them. But
Mm.
we basically look at how they work.
Mm.
And how they work is going to be relevant to how the ones that we haven't actually looked at, they work in the same manner, actually.
Mm.
Of course, in each one, you're going to find certain idiomatic little details, which you just have to know those.
Yeah.
Uh, and those details are not covered, shall we say, in theory.
Mm.
Uh, for example, if you take the makam known as Bestenigar,
Mm.
uh, okay, the theory tells you that, okay, this is, you have Sabah, and then it goes down to Iraq, and okay, that's fine.
Mm.
But they don't tell you that there's a special way that you have to treat the fourth degree of the Sabah movement in order to get to the Iraq movement down there.
Mm.
There's little details in each of these
Yeah.
makams which you have to know.
Mm.
Um, Obviously, we're not able within just the 6 courses to cover all of that.
Mm.
But I do point out that these details do exist, so that you be on the lookout for them when you
Mhm.
encounter a new makam. Look for the special little detail, which is
Mm.
because there's usually some particular detail in each makam which is very, very
Mm.
characteristic and very, very important to notice.
Mhm. And these classes or seminars are
So
really,
that's how that course works.
yeah, they are very practical courses. There is a great deal of analysis and discussion and playing as well of very selective, good material reflective of the culture.
Yes, I've tried to collect and to present in these courses what
Mm.
we call the so-called the hallmark pieces, these very
Mm.
characteristic pieces which clearly demonstrate the material relevant to each makam. That for me is important
Mm.
because it shows people in a very practical way exactly what we're talking about. It's not just sort of
Mm.
theoretical blah blah.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Yes, wonderful. So, Master, can we have a break? Let's maybe
yes, of
take
course. Yeah.
one of your recent performances or pieces, composed
Oh,
pieces. Let's enjoy it with our viewers.
okay. Okay.
Mm.
Um, well, uh, I did a composition fairly recently in a makam, a rather a little known makam known as Hijaz Ashiran,
Mhm.
which basically uses Hijaz and Uzal phrasing, but
Mhm.
ends up coming down into the lower register
Mhm.
onto the Hijaz, the Husseini Ashiran note down on the very, very low mi in this
Mhm.
particular case.
Mm.
So this is a semi I composed using the Hijaz Ashiran mode.
Mm. Interesting. We'll listen to it then.
Okay.
So, welcome back, viewers. My question here, connecting to the seminars, to the idea of the phrasing of the makam, to Rose's, what to listen to and what compositions shall we pay attention to comprehend and maybe get hold of some of the practical knowledge of the phrasing of the
Okay.
makam.
Well, certainly in each tradition, there are a certain number of widely recognized masters of those traditions,
Mhm,
either from the past or in the present, who it makes absolute sense to listen to those people.
mhm,
For example, in the in the Turkish tradition, some of the masters I mentioned previously, such as Niyazi Sayin, for example,
mm,
Necdet Yaşar, İhsan Özgen,
mm,
Erol Deran, all of these people were extremely important, extremely influential as
mm,
instrumentalists. And then, of course, there's a huge number of very great singers as well. The singers are most important to listen to
mm,
because, after all the musical instruments are actually an imitation of the human voice.
mm,
A very significant figure in the 20th century, of course, was Hafiz Kani Karaca.
mm,
He was a very, very important vocalist. Or someone like Alaeddin Yavaşça was also very, very significant.
mm,
Or a female singer such as Meral Uğurlu or Güzin Değişmez. These are
mm,
very important, very significant singers as well.
mm,
So we should be listening as much as possible to these people,
mm,
or people of that caliber, so to speak, in
mm,
any of the traditions. I mean, I suppose in the Iranian tradition, of course, you'd be listening to someone like Shajarian, very, very important figure.
mm,
Um, and, there are several people, uh, really brilliant instrumentalists in that tradition as well.
mhm,
And the Arabic tradition, of course, there's an equally large number
mm,
of very significant names who've been very, very important
mhm,
in the development of that particular musical tradition.
mhm,
So we should always be on the lookout for people like that to listen to.
mhm,
And it's good to listen to as much as you can of the whole spectrum of the repertoire.
mm,
There are, of course, amazing, brilliant compositions coming from the distant past, but
mm,
there are equally brilliant compositions being created today.
mm,
Um, we should, do our best to try and listen to everybody, to listen to
mm,
the old compositions, but also to the some of the very beautiful compositions being done today
mm,
by certain people who have been able to absorb the tradition, digest
mm,
it, and work with it creatively in a way which is actually coherent with everything which has come from the past as well.
mm,
Not just a copy of the past, but not modernized, so to speak.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the criteria is very hard to pick other than, getting an advice or maybe taking the time to know who are the
Exactly.
great masters, right?
Just
Unless
as
we get an
learning,
advice
yes,
from an
ju-
expert.
just as learning to play this music is a process which takes time,
Mm,
learning to appreciate it also is a process which takes time.
mm,
It's not pop music which, you suddenly latch onto it and it becomes what we call an earworm and sticks in your head. No,
yeah.
it's music which takes time to understand and to
Mm,
appreciate. And
mm,
it's something which, of course, if you do
mm,
spend the time and make the effort to understand it, it will
mm,
reward you very richly because it's a very rich world and
mm,
it's got a lot to offer.
mhm,
But like anything of real worth, it's something which takes time and effort.
mhm.
It's not instant.
Interesting. Interesting. Now I
It's
see the instrument in front of
it's not
me.
instant coffee. Anyway, yeah.
Let's go into some demonstration of.
Okay.
Let's start with like the basic element. Beyond
Okay.
the notes, we have the phrase.
Yes. Okay.
Maybe let's take some phrases and then go into.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's take something as very basic as the Makam Rast, for example.
Mm,
Rast actually is it's a fairly small entity, really. It
mm,
looks like what we call a major
mm,
uh, like major scale intervals.
Mm,
But what happens is that the third degree of Rast is, of course, very, very low, which we know.
mm, mhm,
So that very low third degree makes sense within a certain type of phrasing.
mm,
Um, and another type of phrasing, which would be more relevant to what we would call a major pentachord,
mm,
wouldn't really make the same sense when you're
mhm,
trying to do that within the intervals of Rast. So
mm,
Rast is a very heavy makam, which likes to, at least the Turkish version of it,
mm.
is quite a heavy makam, which likes to work in its low area. That's a movement in Rast. It goes up
Mhm,
to its octave, but very briefly.
mhm,
It starts out. Uses very briefly that do sharp there to accent its fifth degree.
mm,
That's a phrase from
mhm,
an old song by Dede Effendi, 18th
mm,
century song.
mm,
Sorry. Yeah. So that's a very typical Rast phrase, or it also does this quite commonly. It'll go below its tonic to make a conclusion. That's a very, very typical phrase also.
mm,
It goes up to its fifth degree. A sort of a pulsating movement on the note mi there, but it doesn't want to go up above that yet. Likes to stop on its second degree, giving a brief mention of Ushak.
mhm, mhm,
Back to its base again.
mm,
It likes to do that using the fa natural, so it likes to use its flattened sixth degree basically. Then, if it goes up to its octave, it basically is doing what we call mahur, which
mhm, mhm,
so it uses alternately the fa and the fa sharp,
mhm,
depending on whether it's doing that movement there on its fifth degree,
mhm,
or we've now shifted to mahur, which is up on the
mm,
octave. The intervals are slightly harder. Very very brief mention of Husseini there. That's how a makam like Rast would work. Starting off with something very, very basic, which is that's the central figure of it. Then
Yeah.
going up to the fifth degree. So we have the Rast, which is, it works around its tonic. The Ushak movement. Then it will want to go up to its fifth degree. So there you've done, within a space of about an octave, you've done the various different aspects of Rast in the different registers, in the middle of it, in the top of it, in the bottom of it. You can now start to do modulations doing something different. Like you can, in the top part, you can be, you're on your fifth degree, you can now flatten. This becomes Suzinyak. Which is just putting Hijaz on its fifth degree. Oh, there are many other things you can do as well. You can make an Evij movement on its seventh degree. Or you can also, when you're in the Mahur element there, you can just put a bit of Nikriz on the end, and that together with Mahur is a makam called Zavil. These are things which you can do, putting little different flavors in different areas, different parts of the makam itself, and you can connect all these things together.
Yeah, interesting. So this material, or when you say or, is coming
Yes,
from two sources, either the repertoire, rich
yes,
repertoire and exposure to it, or your own experience as a musician,
exactly,
where you
both.
see that this is beautiful, we can bring this as a recipe, or this is a very interesting idea, maybe it's worth a composition, isn't it?
Yes.
Mm,
Let's say, let me show you something
mm,
from. There's a very famous
mm,
semi in Rast by Kemani Tatios.
yeah.
Okay, the basic material of it, this is what he does. Sorry, it's gone out of tune. There you go. That's the first Hane. It's very, very basic, very, very specific, very clear Rast material there.
Yeah.
And he goes up to the fifth degree. So the first Hane and Teslim are a very clear exposition of the very basic and very important material of Rast itself, all down in the lower section of it, down in the lower level of it. And very, very, very characteristic phrasing. He then, however, in the second Hane goes up to the fifth degree. Oops, sorry. Excuse me. He goes up to the fifth degree and he then flattens the note Mi, and we get the Hijaz on Re. By the way, for those of you who are listening, I'm one tone higher on this instrument. I'm calling it Re, but it's in fact Mi.
Yeah.
The whole instrument is tuned one tone higher. This is what we do quite often anyway.
Yeah.
So we go. This is Susanak here. He's taken the Rast here, but then also very soft Hijaz here. This Mi flat is flat, of course, but it's not a full Mi flat. It's not that. It goes back to Rast for the Teslim. He's back into Rast again. So what he did there, he did a modulation whereby he just altered one note, basically. But he altered all the phrasing accordingly. It isn't just a question of just one note difference. There's a big difference there in terms of all the phrasing. So now he goes to the third Hane, and here he does something very interesting. He starts on Mahur, which is very typical, because the third Hane always goes up to the high register. In Mahur, now, so here he's changed three notes. This is a big modulation,
Yeah.
a difficult one to do, a very beautiful one actually. It's actually Ushak on the note Neva. That's what we get. So we started off with Mahur. Now Fa natural and C and B flat. Mi semi flat. Now he'll go to Sega. Down there, he's come down. The Mi has become a tiny bit low. Sega, so this note has gone higher now than it was in Rast, and also there's a La sharp below it. back to Rast. Then to the test theme. So there you see, within those three hanes in the Teslim, how he's taken something which really starts from this very, very basic, this basic little thing here, extending it and giving it more room to expand in different directions. And of course he came up, especially in the third hane, with that modulation, a big modulation there. I mean, that's definitely something which, if you listen to that and you learn this that modulation, how he did that, you could definitely find a way in your own taksim, for example, to incorporate a modulation of that type into, say you're doing a ras taksim, you suddenly throw in that that bit of nevaushak there or something like that. Very, very...
Yeah.
and you learn how to do that through the composition, through that melody in the composition. Or, you know, it's a different... If somebody says to you, okay, this is Rast. They play that major scale. They say, this is Susinak. They just flatten the mi. Okay. So what do you do with that? You don't really know what to do with that. But if you know that his modulation in the second hane is... Okay, you've heard that. Now you know how to use that. That's shown you what to do with it. You know,
Yeah.
it's not just a question. These are the notes. Do what you like. This is what it should sound like. This is the feeling in it.
Interesting. And
The
that
note,
master, the
sorry, yes,
same.
go ahead.
It's the same thing for seeing the sheet music.
Yes,
If we don't understanding like phrases that are
yes,
coming together, maybe interacting together, it's maybe difficult to memorize, difficult to comprehend the relationship between notes because these are not notes; these are
yes.
phrases, characters,
Phrases. Yes, yeah,
archetypes.
yes.
Yeah. Mm.
You know, let's say that you want to read a sentence in a piece, you know, in a book. You read a sentence and you want to remember that sentence.
Yeah.
Okay, you remember it as a sentence. You don't remember individual words, which are then jumbled up, and you have to remember each individual word. It doesn't make sense. That
Yeah.
you remember the sentence because you remember the meaning,
Yeah.
and you remember the phrase here because you remember the feeling of it. You remember the sound of it and how the whole thing is, how it works as a whole entity, not just as individual notes. So that's why the phrasing is particularly important in this particular type of music, is that it gives you a sense of whole sentences, of whole musical statements, if you will.
And now that you
Make it more
have
accessible. Yeah.
yeah, now that you have demonstrated the rest, where we call this a basit makam,
Yes.
a simple makam.
Yes.
See
Yes.
how much richness are there.
Oh yes. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we compare this with a compound makam
Okay.
soon. But before
Well.
that,
Yes.
I like the way you demonstrated a rust in a scale and then a Suzanak in a scale.
Yes.
Is it possible to demonstrate a Whosamina scale?
No. No.
Why
Hosam.
not?
Well, because there's so much overlapping within the same area of Hosam that it would be practically impossible to call it a scale. So let's see that the very basic material of Hosam is this. We start on the note Sega. We have this Sega phrase down here, okay? Then on top of that, on the third degree of it, we have a very, very soft Hijaz. It's not. It's. Usually this re sharp or mi flat is known as hisar. The note either dik hisar, nim hisar, hisar. But in this particular case, there's a particularly high mi flat, which is actually known as huzam, this note. And your final note is here on this segah note. Now, there are some people who say that in huzam you should avoid the la sharp as much as possible. And that your conclusion is a descending phrase down to the segah note. And of course, you can use the lasher. Of course you can. But some people say that it's better to avoid that la sharp as much as you can, to give it a more clear huzam flavor and less of a segah. Okay. I'm not sure that I entirely agree with that, but anyway. But what we do have, however, is a lot of segah phrasing inside of huzam. We can even use what's called the exik segah phrasing, which is using the fa natural. We can even use that phrase inside of huzam. We can also use rast. So we can use down here rast. We also have, when we go up, we use the C, the note C, as a flat. So we're doing like Humayun, a very soft Humayun from Re. But we also have this segah phrase around the note evij as well. Segah in the top on the octave. Coming down. So we have all of this stuff going on in that area there. You could even, all sorts of things going on in this same area. They all overlap. There's also the possibility to use ushak on the note re as well. This is a bit of a reference to Avij actually, but anyway. Let me play for you some pieces from a very beautiful little semai written by a contemporary composer called Jamil Azbal, which 2, 3. First Hane, very, very clear, Huzam Majil. Then Teslim. Rast. And a Sega ending.
Mhm.
Then goes the Sega.
Mhm.
And back to that Hijaz on Re. So we get
Mhm.
Teslim. I'll hook up the octave now.
Mhm.
Sega on the top. So he started off with Sega up on the top there.
Mhm.
Now he goes, he'll pivot here and use the C flat,
Mhm.
descending to the Hijaz on Re.
Mhm.
Then Teslim. In his
Very
fourth
good.
Hane, he doesn't actually do any major modula. It's a
Mhm.
basic, just a change of rhythm.
Mhm.
Just has the Huzam with a Siga ending, but also a bit of Rast
Mhm.
as well. Here's the Rast. Just a change of rhythm, basically. Nothing really,
Mhm.
no major modal variation there. But in the other three Hanes, yes, he does interesting things there,
Mhm.
which show the complexity of a makam such as is Huzam, which
Mhm.
has a lot of overlapping material within the same register.
Mhm.
So it would be impossible to describe it as a scale entirety.
Interesting. So now, Master, you already demonstrated a compound maqam in
Yes,
this, right? So Huzam is an
yes,
example of a compound.
it is.
So you
Huzam is a
answered.
compound makam,
So
yes.
you answered two
Yeah.
questions.
The next
In
question,
this.
yes, yeah. Yeah, Huzam is a very good example, actually, of a
Yeah.
compound makam. That's true, yes, yes.
Yeah. Great. So basically, what constitutes to a compound maqam is that, for example, Rust was standing alone if we just build into Rust material, right?
Yes,
Without modulating even. It could reflect and show the character of a person, as you said before, called
yes, a very
Rust.
basic
Yeah.
melody in Rast
Mm.
would not need to incorporate material from other modes. Of
Mm.
course, the vast majority of compositions, however,
Mm.
do incorporate elements from other modes.
Yeah.
Um, but in the case of Rast, it is not essential. I mean, you
Mm.
could actually have a melody in Rast which is made up entirely of rast material.
Mm.
In general, it's considered, especially in a big composition such as is a peshrev or a semai, to
Mm.
do a whole peshrev or semai without any modulation would be considered to be rather boring, actually. I mean, you're
Exactly.
supposed to do a certain amount of modulation there.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
Even if it's only shifting the accent within a given set of notes. It doesn't
Mm.
even have to be a change of tone material. You can
Yeah.
have the same notes, but just a total shift of emphasis, which means that it actually does become another makam.
Hmm.
Um, but it would be essential. But in simpler forms, like, there are plenty of pieces in, for example, the ilahi form, which is just a simple religious hymn.
Mm.
They're meant to be sung by ordinary people. They're not necessarily
Yeah.
created for the sake to be sung or played by musicians entirely. They're meant to be sung by people.
Yeah.
So quite often they are simple compositions,
Mm.
which maybe don't do so much modulation.
Mm.
And that's why they're often very, very good examples to teach people the basic elements
Mm.
of specific makams. And we have uh,
Yeah.
certain of these. I mean, here's one in Hijaz. This is it's a very simple ilahi melody, which is just within the bottom
Mm.
level of Hijaz. It's also sung in Syria, as far as I know. That's the whole piece. That's it. It just
Yeah.
gets repeated over and over again with different lyrics.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Mm.
very simple. It doesn't do anything other than Hijaz, but it's very beautiful. And it's very useful, actually. And if I want to tell somebody what is Hijaz, I can
Hmm.
play that little melody for them, and it's very helpful for them to understand what Hijaz is
Hmm.
on a very basic level. Yeah.
Yeah. Just for a distinction between what is a basic versus a compound makam,
Yes.
removing the confusion of modulation. So
Yes.
why do we call some as compound? Because they need to have some other flavors together, like a recipe, right?
Yes.
Like by a chef. He said,
Yes.
if you want this is a good recipe, we call it Wazam.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. I mean, there are pieces in which just a very basic Huzam movement
Mm.
is used. This.
Mm.
There are some pieces which use just that
Mm.
and don't use much else.
Mm.
Um, and okay, there are pieces in Huzam, but really the full Makam Huzam, if we want to really expose it, it does need a lot of material.
Mm.
Whereas to expose what is Makam Oshak, for example,
Mm.
doesn't require much material. And in many cases, in the case of Oshak, for example,
Mhm.
when you go beyond its fourth degree,
Yeah.
you're really moving into the area of other makams,
Mhm.
basically. Uh,
Mm.
and for the Turkish system, at least, the distinction between, should we say, Ushak and Bayati is very fine.
Mm.
Um, this is very typical Ushak.
Mm.
Down on its tonic, down low, very, very low second degree.
Yeah.
Stop on its leading tone. To the fourth degree briefly. That's very typical Ushak. Bayati would be more accenting the fourth degree. Then the real characteristic of Bayati is that it accents the sixth degree. accenting of the sixth degree, that note fa, ajem as we call it. This is very, very important to Beati. So Beati needs a lot of this triangle between fa, re, do. This area there is very, very important to Beati. Whereas in Ushak you would not really accent that too much because it would become confused with Beati. And if you did start to use that movement, you would actually be making a modulation into Beati. If we take Salidades Semai, for example, uh, in Ushak, straight down to the Rast. See. Back to Ushak. Fourth degree. Stopping on that segano, it's important for Ushak.
Yeah.
Teslim. Very important that. This is very important conclusion for Ushak. That there. So then he goes, now he goes to the second Hane. All this is Ushak, but now he's gone to Beati. Coming back down to Ushak. So there, what he shows you is that just that one note, that one accent there, everything down here in the second Hane was all Ushak. One note changes everything. Re, do, fa, re, do again. Now he comes down to Ushak. So what happens there is he goes up, he accents the fa, then he starts working with that fa, re, do triangle, which is the characteristic element of Beati, for the Turkish Beati at any rate, yeah.
Interesting.
The
So,
Arabic one is rather
yeah,
closer to Arushak, but anyway, yeah, yeah,
yeah. So,
yeah.
Master, do you think Bayati is a basic makam or a compound makam?
Well, I think it's both actually. In the Arabic tradition, it seems to be closer to a basic makam, whereas in the Turkish tradition, I would say it's more of a compound makam, and that our equivalent to your Bayati is Arushak probably. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. It's
and
just a slight difference in terminology, which of course happens all the time. This is normal. Yeah.
yeah, and the reason is that it requires a lot of flavors for the Bayati, the Turkish Bayati.
Yes,
Yeah,
it really
to show the
requires this.
character. Yeah.
Yes, it requires this movement around the note ajem, the sixth degree, the fa note is very, very important.
Hmm.
It requires that triangle fa re do re fa re do. This is very, very important also to it, and it also uh, okay. Not all pieces do this, but a vast majority of pieces will also include an element of Hijaz on the fourth degree. But I believe that that's also true of the Arabic. The Arabic Bayati, it will also do that very frequently. It's
Yeah.
not an absolute essential, but it's very, very commonly done. It's a very
Yeah.
important movement.
It would depend on the region too. Like in Egypt,
Yeah,
they like the Hijaz in the upper side for rest
yeah,
and
yes,
Bayati and always have Huzam most of the time rather than Siga. So
yeah, yeah,
it
yeah.
depends. Yeah. This is really wonderful. I mean, I like the way you simplify things. Now, how many makams do we have in the model of the
Well,
phrasing? Practically.
um, practically, uh, well, I haven't taken the trouble to really count them, but let's put it this way. Um, in historical treatises,
Mm,
the number of maqams is said to extend to something to the order of 800 or something like that.
mm,
That's what I'm told. Of course, very few of these are actually in current use. Many
mm,
of them, there are many maqams which historically existed but which are not in use today.
mm,
It's said that at one time in history that musicians were offered a prize of money for creating a new maqam, and they would have to create a Peshev and the Semai, and then, okay, so at that particular, it's supposedly Selim III is the person who did this.
mm,
Uh, Clever idea, actually, because it does encourage people to really sort of test their creative skill and can we
mm.
create something new.
Yeah.
As far as I know, Sultan Selim himself created 11 new maqams himself,
Mm,
of which several are in use today, actually.
mm,
So what happens is that of all these hundreds of maqams that must have been created at that particular time, some of them were just, somebody just took an existing maqam, changed one note here in one phrase, and so this is a new maqam. Okay. Maqams like that didn't actually survive. There was no continuation to them. Nobody
mm,
composed anything else. I mean, there's just the original composition, that's it.
mhm,
Whereas other maqams which are created uh, at certain times, especially at that time or in other times following that in history,
mm,
they gained, people liked those maqams, and new
mm,
composers composed new things in that maqam, and so they developed a repertoire.
mm,
And they did actually have a reason to exist.
mm,
They weren't just one little modulation within an already existing maqam.
mm,
So what did happen was that many new, what you referred to previously as recipes, which I completely agree with that description,
mhm,
many new recipes did appear,
mhm,
which people found to be interesting. Not all of them were interesting, of course. Some of them were, okay, but, you know, sometimes you have to create a lot of things for two or
mm,
three or four or five things of interest to actually appear. You have to
mhm.
create maybe 100.
Yeah.
So that's what happened. So today, let's say that there are approximately 100 maqams in existence today, which
Mhm,
it is possible to hear.
mhm,
Of these 100 maqams, 50 of them would be, you'd have a chance of hearing them on maybe a few occasions.
mhm,
Of these, 25 are quite frequently used, yeah,
mm,
and very commonly encountered. Of these, maybe half of them
mm,
are encountered on an almost everyday basis. Yeah.
mm.
So
Interesting.
this is a very rough estimation, of course. It's not at
Mm,
all accurate, but anyway. But
mm,
that gives you an idea that there's certain maqams which are every day you're going to hear Hijaz and Ushak and Husseini and Nihavend and things like that. Yes.
mm,
Whereas you're not going to hear Dil Keshide so often,
mm,
and you're certainly not going to hear Guldeste very often either.
mm,
That's a rather rare one that people don't tend to use, even though it's a very beautiful one actually.
mm,
But it's not all that commonly used. And then there are other maqams like, I don't know, well, the one I referred to previously, Maverauna here, it exists. There are very few compositions in it. You
mm.
may hear it once in 10 years, that's
Yeah.
about it. Yeah, if that.
Uh,
Yeah.
mm. Any
Um,
any intentions of creating any maqams, master?
well, I have created a couple actually, yeah.
I'm sure
It's
about
something
that.
which is not really so difficult to do
Yeah.
as one might imagine. What I
Mm,
did do
mm,
was I made a combination of an Indian raga known as Multani,
mm,
which is something which doesn't actually exist in the. I mean, it looks like Neveser from Duga. Here's Neveser. So it's Nikris. Hijaz on top of that. Okay, Now fully flatten the second degree and you get what's called Multani in Hindustani.
Okay.
So what you get with Multani is you have this thing down here around the note Duga. It looks a bit like Sega, but it's
Mm.
followed by something totally different. That also looks like Sega. That's its concluding phrase. So I combined it with Sabah Zemzeme, which is, and a bit with also Charga. So we get this. That's part of the Semai which I've written in that Makam.
Mhm.
So it's something which didn't pre-exist. It's of course relying on pre-existing material. It's just a new
Mhm.
recipe of
Yeah.
existing. That's all it really is, really.
Interesting.
And
Is
any
this?
new Makam is going to be it's going to be a new recipe of existing material. It's not going to be a completely new creation out of nothing. No.
Yeah, for sure. And is this recording available online?
I
This of
haven't
the Makam?
recorded it. No,
Mm.
actually, I have it planned for a concert on the 2nd of April.
Mhm.
Which we'll do here, and which we will actually record it, so it'll
Mhm.
be available soon.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Wonderful. Looking forward to it actually.
yeah.
Uh, Master, this is really great. I think we have touched into many important discussion points here. Let's conclude by asking about the extension of this idea to the usuls.
Usuls,
Mm.
usuls are very, very important,
Mm.
and the fact that there is less emphasis today in the educational system,
Mm.
in Turkey, for example, where there's the very large number of usuls.
Mm.
The usuls were the backbone of the compositions.
Mm. Mhm.
Uh, if you listen to the especially some of the phrasing in Semai and Peshrev especially,
Mm.
you can see some enormously long phrases. I mean, I cannot think of another genre of music in which we have such long phrases which don't lose their balance and don't lose their energy. It's a
Mm.
difficult thing to do, actually, to create these very long melodies. Because
Mm.
usually when you try and create a very long melody, you need something to support it. Otherwise, it'll just sort of collapse. It'll just sort of start going back on itself. And it's difficult to maintain the
Mm.
momentum, the energy, and the balance necessary to create these very, very long melodies.
Mhm.
And this is something which I believe, at least I think other people would agree with this is the result of the usul as a percussion pattern, not
Mm.
just a rhythm like 4/4 or 6/4 or something. No, it's a whole big rhythmic phrase,
Okay.
and this is what gives the backbone to
Mm.
these very long and quite intricate and difficult melodies.
Mm.
Interesting enough, I was recently reading a paper written by somebody about the composer of the 14th century, Abdul Qadir Meragi,
Mhm.
who was from what is today Meraga, which is in Azerbaijan.
Mm.
He's a musician. It's difficult to say, is he of the Persian tradition? Is he of the Turkish tradition? Is he of which tradition? It's from a time when the distinction was not all that clear between all of those different things.
Yeah.
So he was a court musician in various different locations, including even as far afield as Afghanistan, apparently.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
and he was very creative, and he was a wonderful composer. And it's described that his new composition was actually an usul.
Mm.
The composition was described. He said, "I've created this new usul, basically this new rhythmic pattern, and on that he composes a new melody and
Mm.
a new piece."
Mhm.
So even somebody at that time in history is using the usul as his blueprint for his composition. This is what he
Mm.
works with. This is the skeleton on which he works,
Mhm.
and this is what's going to give it its structure.
Mhm.
Um, and I do believe that that makes sense, because I don't think that the people who were composing this music in these early times, that they were sitting down at a desk with a pen and paper. Now I'm going to compose a piece of music and things. No, I
Mm.
think that many of these compositions developed as extended improvisations
Mhm.
on rhythmic patterns, which they also say that in older times that the study of usuls constituted the majority of the time invested by a musician in his study. They would
Mm.
study for hours and hours, beating these usuls on their legs,
Mm.
um, and
Yeah.
reciting the syllables and learning them to such a degree that this thing was just completely digested, and
Mm.
they could improvise and hear the usul in their head as they went along, and this would give
Mm.
a structure to their improvisation, and
Mhm.
these would gradually crystallize
Mhm.
into um, into compositions,
Yeah.
which would then be remembered and handed down.
Mhm.
Um, so that's why I think that the usuls are very, very important. They're at the very root of this music.
Mm.
Usul and makam. These are the two very, very basic elements,
Mm.
which are the root of this music. Much like raga and tala in Indian music, this is the
Mm.
foundation of their music.
Yeah.
Uh, in equal measure, I would say.
Mhm.
And I would say the same thing concerning the usul, and even the together with the usul, we also have the syllables of the poetry and things like
Mhm.
that, which is very, very important
Mm.
in because many of these forms are actually song forms. So
Mm.
the intersection of the usul with the syllables used for the creation of the meters of poetry, these are very,
Mm.
very important details, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then you encourage or maybe you also perceive the phrasing of the usul itself to see how it
Yes.
stands out and how do they relate to each other and so on. And
Yes.
maybe with this we can emphasize into bringing new forms and a new structure for compositions rather than sticking
Yes.
to few some, right?
Yes.
Mm.
You know, the creation of a new soul is always possible, of course. I mean,
Mm.
this is, I mean, you can always come up with new rhythmic patterns,
Mm.
um, and which can form the foundation of a composition.
Mhm.
And of course, there is a huge number of them,
Mhm.
many of which are no longer used, which is a bit
Yeah.
sad, actually, because I
Mm.
mean, I'm sure there's a lot you can do with them.
Mhm.
So, on the one hand, we can be creating new ones. On the other hand, we can be reviving old ones which have fallen into disuse, unfortunately.
Mhm. Yeah.
And both of these tools could be used to enrich and to broaden the horizon of the music. Yes.
Mm. Interesting. So I would like to hit into what you said, learning and digesting.
Yes.
Yeah, and especially that we are talking about comprehending such repertoire for somebody to utilize and maybe create.
Yes.
Yeah, learning process versus digestion and yeah.
Exactly.
Mm.
Well, continuing from what we were discussing
Mm.
about usul previously,
Mm.
um, there's a particular type of 9/8 rhythm used here in Greece. It's the Zebec rhythm. It's
Mm.
very, very similar to the Zebec rhythm used in Turkey. It's a bit different. I mean, this is an idiom which started in what is today Turkey and moved to Greece at the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And it's sort of developed sort of its own way ever since. Ever since. So there's a very specific rhythm called the
Mm.
Zebec rhythm here in Greece,
Mhm.
which it's a type of slow 9/8 or 9/4, some people call it.
Yeah.
Um, and I have a very good friend who used to work in bouzouki clubs for many, many years, where this rhythm is played over and over again every night.
Mm.
So he spent years and years uh, playing this particular rhythm every night in the bouzouki clubs where he used to work and things like that.
Mhm.
And one day I was just at his house and he was just sitting there with his instrument, improvising on this 9/8 rhythm and doing all sorts of quite complicated things, but always being exactly right within that rhythm.
Mm.
And at one point he stopped and said, you know, I've listened to this rhythm so much during my life, and I've played it for so many years, every night, that I can improvise in this rhythm, and uh, not only do I not go out of it, but I cannot go out of it. It's so deeply ingrained in me. And this was interesting for
Mm,
me because this is, I'm sure, what the experience of people was like in previous times. The
mm,
experience of Usul was like that, that it was
mm,
so deeply ingrained in them. This is the
mm,
digestion I'm talking about, where
mm,
it becomes very much, you don't even have to think about it. It's there and it's
mm,
working inside you. And
mm,
everything you do is working with it. Yeah.
mm,
And so this is the depth of knowledge necessary to unlock the creative process, in my view. When you're having to think about it, it's not going to work.
mm.
Thinking is much too slow for music. Uh, you know,
Like that. Yeah.
music happens at a speed, at a different speed,
Mm,
and so you can only really be effective in music when you're working with things you've fully digested, and
mm,
it just comes out naturally.
mm,
If you're having to think it through and things like that, it's too slow. It's not going
mm.
to work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting. Rose, this was another great interview that we have enjoyed. Let me just conclude with the last question. What are
Yes,
you
of
up
course.
to nowadays? Let's
What
talk
am I up
about,
to now? Yes.
yeah, what's
Well,
happening next?
we're finally coming back to the organization of live events at the Musical Workshop Labyrinth,
Mm-hmm.
which for me is a great joy, of course. We have now at the end of March and the beginning of February, we'll be doing 6 seminars live in Archanis, which is just
Mm,
next to Hudetsi, here on Crete, um, which will be seminars of. I'll be doing one myself. Also, Keri Thoma will be doing one with lira.
mm,
Also, Yasamin Shah Hosseini will do one with the Iranian style of oud playing.
mm,
Yorgos Xylouris will do one for the Cretan lauto and Cretan repertoire in general. Charis Lambrakis will be doing one about rhythmic improvisation.
mm,
And Pedram Khavarzamini will be doing Iranian percussion, tombak primarily.
mm.
So these are the seminars we have coming up.
Wow.
Together with a series of concerts featuring all these different musicians.
Mm,
Incidentally, this year, 2022, is Labyrinth Musical Workshop's 40th birthday. We started in
mm.
1982, you know, our
Wow.
very humble beginnings.
Yes.
Um, so it's now 40 years since then, and so we're celebrating that.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a lot planned for the coming summer, but not just the summer, because
Mm,
uh, we will have a new building in
mm,
Hudetsi, in our hometown, so to speak,
mm-hmm.
in which we will have the ability to conduct seminars all year round. So we will
Wonderful.
do that for sure, because up until now we had to rely on the school building of the village, which was only available for 2 months every summer.
Mm,
Excuse me. Um,
mm.
and So we will now have this new building, which will enable us to do seminars all year round.
Mm-hmm.
So we intend to do that, and together with the seminars, of course, concerts as well. Uh, and so we're coming back to live activities,
Mm.
uh, and hopefully actually increasing the live activities from what they were prior to the coronavirus
Mm-hmm.
escapade. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
so that's what we're up to, basically.
I say congrats. This is really a great thing to hear,
Yeah.
and looking forward to it really. And
Yes. So
all the community of Labyrinth,
yes.
extended community.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we're looking forward to welcoming you all of you here on Crete whenever you get the chance, whenever it's
Yeah.
suitable for yourselves.
Yes.
And of course, we'll keep our programs posted on our website, on our Facebook pages, and
Mm.
so that it's available to anybody to know exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
Um, I wish everybody a happy return to normal musical activity, and let's all uh, do our very best to make music a bigger presence in the life of people,
Mm.
because I believe that music brings people together. And at this particular time in our history, we really need that, because we
Mm-hmm.
see all sorts of rather ugly examples of people not being together. So that more music and more people together. That's what I'd like to see.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.